Welcome back to the Political Marketing Podcast with me, Benedict Pringle. This is the podcast that seeks to understand how election candidates, political parties, campaigning organisations, and other people with political objectives win hearts, minds, and votes. This podcast is very, very new, so please help me surf the algorithms of discovery by subscribing and sharing it with your Politico friends. My guest today is Sir Chris Powell. Chris is one of the most respected figures in British advertising and communications. Sir Chris was knighted in 2011 for services to advertising. He was a core member of Bose Massimi Pollitt, or BMP, an advertising agency which later became BMP DDB. It's one of the most influential agencies in UK advertising history, and more recent incarnations of the agency continue to be very, very successful today. From 1985 until 1997, Chris advised the Labour Party on election strategy in a group known as the Shadow Communications Agency. And BMP, under his leadership, also published a book called How the Left Learned to Love Advertising. And more recently, Chris co-authored a pamphlet called Winning Against Populists, which analysed how to defeat populist movements through effective political marketing. It's a topic that's particularly pertinent given Reform UK is currently leading the polls, and last week YouGov's most recent MRP reported that if there was a general election last week, Reform UK would have emerged as the largest party, which is pretty sobering thoughts. So for all those reasons, I was very excited about the prospect of having Sir Chris on the show, and he was very kind to agree to come on. So welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
I'm sure you're bored to tears talking about it, but you would be amazed by how often I've heard people say the words Shadow Communications Agency. It's still very much something that is in the folklore of political marketing. For the uninitiated, could you tell us what the Shadow Communications Agency was and how it came about?
Well, it didn't really exist, of course. It's a sort of convenient fiction. The reason we really called BMP the Shadow Communications Agency for two main reasons. One is, when we started work in the Foot and Kinnock days, it was extremely unpopular with the clientele of advertising agencies to be associated in helping such causes. So it seemed sensible to be a little bit anonymous about it. But I always had a problem anyway. How can an agency be political in some way? I mean, does everyone at BNP have to be Labour? Was everyone at Saatchi's a Tory? I mean, it's not like you're doing, Pepsi or something. It's where, you just work on it. I mean, were we meant to order people to work on a Labour business? I mean, clearly, it's volunteers who do it. It's not. It happens to be housed in the agency. And the core of the people were at BNP and part of BNP. But it wasn't a BNP account in the normal sort of way. And oddly, by the time we got to the 1997 election, and we were still working with them, they effectively ordered us to have them as a client because they were embarrassed, because they thought we were embarrassed to be associated with them. So we had to. But I'd much rather not, because it wasn't an ordinary client the other way. The other advantage of doing it is it meant we could be broader than ourselves. So we did have help from people in other agencies, both planning and creative, who contributed to it. So it had that advantage too.
And were those people sort of knocking on your door saying, I'd love to be involved? Or did you go out and speak to people who you thought would be particularly helpful to come in?
From memory, because a long time ago, it was the former. And Leslie Butterfield was one who had his own agency by then. Trevor Beattie, who was, I can't remember where he was then, helped with the creative side. So it was people. Everyone who worked on Labour was a volunteer, whether they were at BNP or whether they were somewhere else and were joining in. And that's the way it should be, in my mind.
And in any sort of advertising and client relationship, you have certain relationships where you're very downstream and you're sort of doing what you're told and, writing the ads and not much more. And then there are some relationships where you're further upstream and you're influencing the whole marketing operation. Whereabouts did B&P or the Shadow Communications Agency play, and did that change over time?
I suspect agencies delude themselves, about quite how far upstream they are. And it varied. When I started with Labour, which was in 1969, actually, when it was Wilson and Heath, we were extremely far down the pecking order. I mean, as low as it was possible to get. All I was allowed to do was a couple of leaflets. But when Peter Mandelson was there, who took a different attitude towards the role of advertising, I don't know. You have to ask them, really. I mean, we advised, but we only advised, and we offered advertisements and we offered strategies, and some they bought and some they didn't. They were undoubtedly in charge, quite right, so they should be. I can't say how influential we were. I like to delude myself, but we had some influence. But mind you, when I say I like to delude myself, we had some influence. I've got a really good track record of losing elections, second to none, I think. Only ever won one. And that was the 1997 one. And that was nothing to do with us or me. It was to do with a man called Blair. That's how much influence we have.
I mean, you've mentioned a few of the people involved. So Peter Mandelson. I mean, there was some other massive, towering figures of political marketing involved at that time. So Philip Gould, Alistair Campbell, Deborah Mattinson, and others who've all gone on to great things. Any particular reflections on what made that group so special, if indeed you did think it was special?
Well, it might be worth just having a bit of background. As I said, I offered my services to the Labour Party because I've always been a Labour man. And in the late 1960s, I didn't seem to have a plethora of advertising people helping them out. But the man who was in charge of such things in those days, in contrast to Peter, who came in 1985, had previously been a studio manager. I don't think he knew what a strategy was. He certainly wasn't interested in having one. But two things I particularly remember about it. Other than when he rang you and you weren't there and he left a message, he would say his name followed by OBE, because he got one, rang, which I've never heard anyone else ever do. a peculiarity. It was such a refreshing thing when Peter got involved in 1985, who does know what a strategy is and is interested in it. And Peter, beyond that, is interested in the whole process of advertising and how you go about it and the use of group discussions, which was completely new to Labour. And heard of such things. And he, working with Philip, who just worked morning, noon and night for years and years and years, did nothing else, just did that heroically, and Deborah too, of course. It was just another world. It was like a really good client. But we had actually, before that, a good experience. We'd worked must be 1983, 1984, with the GLC on, I think, the best political campaign we ever did.
The Greater London Council,
The Greater London Council, campaign. Because the first thing Mrs. Thatcher did when she got elected in 1983 was bring in an act to abolish the GLC, because Ken Livingstone annoyed her. He annoyed lots of people. So she tried to abolish. No, she did it by them. She could do what she liked. She had a huge majority and it was unstoppable. But we did manage to get the vast majority of Londoners opposed to its abolition. And we did work with a guy called John McDonnell, who's a notorious lefty. He's not even Corbyn's chancellor. But he's very bright, John McDonnell. And he's a follower of Mark Hughes. And I'm sure you know about Mark Hughes, who's a very left-wing Italian, spent most of his life in prison, I think, communist. But Mark Hughes' view was, unlike Marx, who says that the economic revolution will precede the revolution, Mark Hughes said, no, it's the cultural revolution that will precede it. And to John McDonnell, advertising was a cultural revolution because it's a way of culturally reaching out to the population and persuading them to do it.
It's interesting.
So he was very receptive.
Yeah. That's it. That's very interesting. In the in the most recent UK general election, when I spoke to lots of the people involved in the Labour Party's campaign, they were again talking about how important culture was to their campaign and how they felt like in order to get a hearing with the public, they needed Labour to be seen as in touch and, culturally relevant and fresh. And it's interesting hearing you talk about folks like Ken Livingstone and John McDonnell, because the left didn't always love advertising, did they? And your agency BNP published a book called "How the Left Learned to Love Advertising," which contains lots of the excellent advertising that you're referring to.
It was awful when Philip and I were first involved. It must have been in the very early days of Peter, I suppose. And we would go to present the results of a group discussion work, actually, to the shadow cabinet. And there's a guy called Eric Heffo. I mean, no one will remember him. He was a very left guy. And I can't remember who the other one was involved in this. But anyway, when we started to present the findings of it, he and his other lefty friend started up a very loud conversation. And I remember Neil Kellogg asked them to tone it down, but they didn't. So we were presenting throughout. There was this loud conversation to drown us out. So, yeah, there was a mild opposition to what advertising brought to the table. And I mean, it had been preceded by Michael Foot. Michael Foot would not allow market research because market research was the devil. Market research meant that you were trying to follow what people wanted. It was very dangerous. The role of politicians was to lead. Well, I mean, it's a perfectly respectable philosophical point of view. And it was a dangerous drug to know what people wanted because it would tempt you away from what you knew to be right to do what would merely get you elected. And therefore it was not allowed.
It's interesting. On the last episode, actually, we had a political marketing professor called Jennifer Lees Marshman, and she talked about exactly this issue, which was finding the balance between leading and following the market, and you almost need to give people what they need, not necessarily what they want, is what she said. Yeah. I thought that was something very true about that.
Yeah, but it's quite hard to do advertising campaigns that might work if you don't know the attitudes of the people you're addressing.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's such a delicate balance. And do you think the left still have blind spots when it comes to marketing?
Not that I know of. I mean, I'm not involved anymore. Certainly not as far as I was ever involved with the Labour Party, which was up until 1997. Although someone said to me that in the last election, they'd reverted to that rather bad habit of going around a number of agencies saying, "Have you got any good ideas?" So it was just a sort of random process. But that may be untrue. I don't know.
Well, I
don't think so. But it was no organised left-wing campaign against advertising or anything like that. Not like there was in the old days. But they may have reverted from the proper marketing strategic, who's your target market, what's the strategy, how's this going to win, and all that we are all brought up to do.
And in more recently, you and David Cowan launched Winning Against Populists, which, as I said at the top, is sort of particularly pertinent everywhere in the world, but particularly in the UK. Could you give us a bit of background as to what led you to start the project?
Fear. I mean, David was head of planning at BNP in the early days. And we worked together then. And then he left and started his own place called Forensics. That was a sort of tip-top research place. And we were having a chat together in a pub 3 or 4 years ago. And it turned out we were both equally terrified of what was beginning to happen around the world with populists. And we thought we might be able to make some contribution because of our background in marketing and advertising. And I mean, it still amazes me, but liberal democracy has not got itself organised to oppose this movement that's going on around the world. The other side have the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, meets majorly once a year, but on some committees of itself more often than that, and they discuss what they're doing and what their plans are and how they're doing it. And there's nothing in liberal around. And then I discovered there was nothing that said what's been going on in elections, what works and what doesn't work, as far as one can tell. So David and I thought, well, that looks like a pretty obvious gap in the market, that maybe we could be some slight use if we started trying to collect this information as best we could from around the world, ideally being there during an election, but otherwise reading up about it and all that sort of thing, wading our way through speeches and all that boring stuff. And that's what we've tried to do. We've published a first booklet. Not you're not allowed to call it a pamphlet.
Oh, sorry. I did wonder if you are.
And I get David tells me off. It's quite right. So it's this one, 7 Lessons for Winning Elections Against Populists. We're about to publish a second one, which sadly we've called 7 Lessons from the Failure to Inhibit the Success of Populism, because
great.
The last year or so has just been dreadful, victory after victory for them. And it's not just a sort of election matter. To me, it is terrifying, because what they do, once they get in, they become extremely hard to remove, because they fix things in their favour. They get constitutional changes by very dubious methods. And then they take over the appointment of judges, so they can do what they like in the courts. They take over the appointment of electoral authority, so they can fiddle elections at will. And they get their mates to buy out the media, who they have impoverished by fraudulent taxpayers, denying any government advertising to the media they don't like and giving it all to the media they do like, and all tricks like that. So they finish up with Turkey, which we know quite a lot about. But there's effectively no media the opposition can use in Turkey now. All the contracts for building and so on go to the government's mates. And the judges, if a candidate, as has happened with Imamoglu, who's an extremely good guy, who's the mayor of Istanbul, was to be the candidate in the presidential elections for the CHP, which is the main opposition there, he just throws them in prison. And any old charge will do, because the judges will do exactly what he tells them to do. And you try changing that. I mean, it's like Belarus,
Yeah.
I mean, if the government is just going to put guns on you, I'm afraid there's not a lot advertising can do.
So you got to stop them before they get started. Yeah,
yes, exactly. No, so why everyone isn't terrified, I don't know, but I am.
But I found it fascinating reading, and as you say, there are 7 lessons in the not a pamphlet, and the first one is about the importance of anti-populist forces cooperating.
Yeah,
and I'm intrigued in this MRP polling that YouGov did. I think it was last week. They showed that the Conservatives, Liberal Democrats, Reform were all within 10, 11 points of each other.
Yeah.
And so you can see this fracturing of the centre right, centre left groups and Reform doing the best out of all 4 of them. If you were advising the groups who are anti-populist to try and take on Reform, what would be your advice be? How would they cooperate in the UK?
Well, you know what it reminds me of? It takes between 10 and 15 years for the Labour Party to decide it really is going to have to start being serious about getting into government. They happily lose 3 elections before they decide to get organised in a way that might win, and sing from one song sheet and all that. And as you know, the coalitions are the norm in most of the world, certainly in Europe. So it has to work by cooperation. But the problem is, if the coalition is too broad, they can agree on nothing. all they agree on is they don't like the government that's there. And that's about it. Well, that's not much of an appeal to the population who would like to know what you might be doing if they voted for you. So the balance has to change from sensitivities about their own particular policies as the parties that are in the coalition to agree that they must find a way of proposing a slate of policies that are of appeal to the electorate that they need to get to vote for them, overcoming just this fact that they can't agree on anything because they got, I'm an ecologist and I want to stick to that or whatever it is.
Yeah.
They don't correct. And how do you induce earlier than 10 to 15 years the idea that that's what you need to do? And it's even true within parties, of course. I mean, look at the Democrats in America now. I mean, what do the Democrats stand for goodness sake? They're all over the place. It might as well be a coalition that's not working. So there's that, in politics, I suppose of course it's inevitable. People are there because they have a particular set of beliefs. And when they have to cooperate with people who have a different set of beliefs, it is very difficult. But if they don't, it is worse because the people who get in can be as bad as the populists, can't they? So there has to be a way of getting that compromise. And, it can take a lot of failed elections till they get there. Well, if you get a lot of failed elections, by the time you get to take on the populists, they'll be running a Belarus-type regime. And you'll not remove them. So I don't know how you do it.
Yeah.
Other than why don't they feel the terror that I feel?
Yeah.
But that's the way the world's going.
So it's slightly in preparation for this conversation. I ran a poll on my Instagram account, which is instagram.com/political advertising for any listeners who don't yet follow. And the following of this Instagram account is almost entirely people who used to or currently work in political campaigns. So it's genuinely a group whose opinion I'm always interested in and sort of canvass with sort of relatively serious intent. So I asked, and there was a poll out showing that lots of Labour's sort of losses since the 24 election, lots of their poll has slipped to the Greens and to the Liberal Democrats and things like that, rather than to Reform. So I sort of showed this poll and I asked the group, should Labour focus on consolidating the anti-populist vote, so bringing back together Greens and Lib Dems and things like that, or should they be trying to minimise Labour switches to Reform, so particularly in the sort of red wall seats where that is a sort of fairly high likelihood, or C, should they try and do both? And it was really interesting. So 53% of the respondents said Labour should try and consolidate the anti-populist vote, which would align with your lesson, I think. Indeed. 29% said do both. And 18% said minimise Labour to Reform switches, so the smallest number. So I wondered what you made of that, and if they are truly agreeing with you, which is, Labour shouldn't be trying to chase down Labour to Reform switches, and instead they should be worrying about that, broad group of anti-populist people who are never going to vote Reform and trying to build a broad enough church that could accommodate the Greens and Lib Dems.
Well, you know what happens because it's most evident. Well, it's evident everywhere, but most evident been recently in America, which is the era of floating voters, which we were all quite rightly brought up on. These are the people who say that. Is they are such a tiny group now. There's very little point in aiming at that. And in fact, one of the reasons our booklet that we're currently working on won't come out till the autumn is because it's dependent on, there's a fantastically large and useful survey done after elections in America that is longitudinal, so it follows the same people through the elections. And you can demonstrate, well, we haven't seen 2024 yet, but you could demonstrate, for instance, in 2020, that Biden's victory was caused more than anything by Democrats who hadn't voted in 2016, who were now enthused to come out after the experience of Trump being in government. So that And it's the same in Poland, actually, with the recent, well, not the recent presidential, but the Tusk election a year or so ago. Again, it was the increased turnout. Same in Slovenia. It was a higher turnout that produced the votes that led to the victory of liberal democracy rather than the populists. So it seems that it's not, none of these rules, by the way, are invariable. Things are different country by country, and there are different stages of the populist development. But it's beginning to look like that's where you need to seek your votes, is from previous non-voters. And it's pretty clear that in 2024, actually, the people who got Trump over the line were people who hadn't voted in the previous election, but also largely made up of people who don't follow the news, who are just uninvolved in it. That young people who don't follow the news, even on social media, actually seek to avoid it often, are the people you've got to get to. And that, of course, leads you around to someone like Trump, who gains attention every single day of the year by his vulgarity and other methods. It is a great asset because he does cut through to these people, where I don't think Mr. Biden would have a chance in hell of getting through to those people. So we're living in a increasingly different world from the one I was politically brought up in, chasing the voter. It's now bashing through to people who haven't voted recently and probably aren't interested anyway.
That's interesting. Turnout rather than persuasion. Yeah, very interesting. And another one of the lessons that I found particularly interesting that I wondered if we could dig into was you warn against directly attacking the populist leader because it can backfire and actually reinforce their support. Just talk to me a little bit about why that is, and if you've had any thoughts about, let's take Farage as the example. If Labour or the Conservatives or the Lib Dems, if they shouldn't attack Farage head on, what should they do?
Well, I know what they should do. And the reason you shouldn't attack Farage head on, well, it's not an unlaw. I mean, you could not run against Trump and not attack Trump. I mean, it would be impossible. But the danger of attacking the populist leader is that his supporters like him. And they think, as they've been taught by the populists, but the country is run by elites, a bunch of snobs who went to university, who think they're clever dicks, and are making life very difficult for people like me and you, sort of thing. And this is further proof that they're elites and against my support, because they don't like the bloke I like, called Farage or Trump or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So you do the opposite of what you're seeking to do. It reached its nadir orbit, didn't it, with Hillary Clinton's terrible thing of saying the voters who voted for Trump were deplorables. Part of the
basket of deplorables.
I mean, that's exactly what they think you think about them. That's actually the motivation they have to support the populists, is they think you sneer at them, but you do nothing to support them. You give all your money to woke lots and things like that. You have nothing to support the good old white working class in America, all that sort of stuff. What you should do is steal their voters, and you steal their voters by addressing the problem that those voters want addressed, but not the daft solutions, no pretend solutions of the populists who just make them up on the go and won't work anyway. So you've got to be, what a Trump or an Orban or the other guy, the Erdogan, is a champion to these people who are voting for them, because they're taking their concerns and their resentments and all that and saying they will address them, they will fight for them. Although, of course, the first thing they do is bring a big, beautiful bill that increases the poverty of poor people and increases the wealth of Wall Street. But that's, of course, beside the point. So you've got to address that and have the solution from your own solution. So actually, David's got rather a good way of expressing it, that you've got to identify the pain that they're feeling. You've got to find a culprit, not a person necessarily, but a party or a group of people or whatever that's causing that. And then your solution to that, what you're going to do about it and make it very clear and simple. And the populists do this very well. And actually, Farage is already doing that. And if you look at Farage on TikTok, he does a masterly job. They're very short, they're very visual, they're very direct, they're very clear, they're single policy, and they're sort of done in ordinary Joe language, which is what, of course, he pretends to be. You look up Starmer on TikTok, well, you can't find anything really anyway. And if you can, it's sort of a speech a Treasury civil servant might have made. You know, it has no appeal or cut through or whatever. So they've learned that sort of direct appeal to the concerns. So what you've got to do to beat them is address those concerns. And those concerns are usually bread and butter stuff. You know, their cost of living, their Medicaid, their things like that. And where actually populist Modi is an example of this, who slipped back a bit in the last elections, you know, in India, go wrong, is when they get carried away by their own nationalistic fervours and pomposities and stuff like that, and stop addressing the economic grievances of the people they need to get around their way. So quite often the answer to populists is actually bread and butter stuff. But, I mean,
so presumably you had your head in your hands when Kamala Harris's campaign were talking about threats to democracy and such like, rather than
democracy is so. There's a wonderful woman as an example in groups in the US leading up to the election when they were trying out this democracy kick, and she said, "Democracy? I haven't got time for that." And I mean, it's some theory democracy. It's the cost of gas, you know, that's important. It's not, you don't get no. And actually, the threat, in my view, should have been chaos. That's what you get. It's not democracy, which people, I'm afraid, regard as something you might learn about at school. But the chaos of the capital invasion, the endless changes of mind, everything upside down. And, you know, indeed, the most likely outcome of this Trump era is the outcome of the last Trump era, that by the end of it, people are just exhausted and have had enough. Would like something a bit more normal, please.
Yeah. And, well, I think your points about showing respect to populist voters and by attacking the populist, you're sort of inadvertently not showing respect, and then creating a sort of a different enemy, which is the sort of root cause of the problem, which the ordinary people, you know, who are tempted by the populist need to have addressed, I think is very compelling. And I think that, you know, that in some ways they're very simple points, but it's so easy to get distracted, isn't it, in a campaign where you can sort of, you see something that Farage does or see something that Trump does, and, you know, find it so outrageous that you end up spending the week talking about what a disgrace it is, rather than focusing on your message.
Indeed, Benedict, they tempt you into it.
Yes.
I mean, quite on purpose. They want you to start doing that because they know it doesn't work for you. It does work for them. And so they set these things up so they know that you'll respond.
Yeah.
They laugh at you.
And you mentioned that you've got a new booklet coming out. When does that come out?
September, I hope. Thereabouts.
Brilliant.
There's a website, by the way, if anyone wants to know how these things are going or when things are going to come out or respond to what's in them, called winningagainstpopulists.com. So it's all up on there. So that's where it will first appear in September. I mean, it is dependent. What's held it up isn't our slowness, although it's a rather enormous task, actually, doing 30 or 40 countries now and trying to follow what's been going on. But it is this American research, which is so good, you have to wait for it. And we were promised it in May, then we promised it in June, and now they've promised it by the middle of this month. And we can't, it would be crazy to produce it without having sight of that research. It will answer this question, amongst others, about whether it really is people who didn't vote last time being enthused to come out this time, differentially between the parties, that's making the difference, and not the old floating voter thing.
Well, I'm excited to learn that the book is about what people have got wrong. Could you give us a little preview? What's the thing that we've got most consistently wrong in taking on the populists?
Well, it depends where you are. Sorry, I don't mean geographically, but if you're the insurgent against a populist government, it's rather a different matter if you're defending against a populist opposition.
Okay, let's do you're taking on a populist insurgent who's a challenger.
Well, what you have to do, it seems to us from the evidence, is address these concerns. I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself now, but if you don't do anything about immigration, to be honest, you're not going to get elected. So, I mean, Biden did a rather good demonstration of that. You can't just ignore them because you don't approve of the issue. You've got to handle it in some way or other. Otherwise, the populists will do it for you in a particularly nasty and vicious and damaging to everyone way. Mm. So you've got to understand the resentments and concerns of these voters and deal with them in your way. You've got to identify the pain, identify a culprit who people can decide that, and what you're going to do about it. And if you're in government, that's even more the case. And it's going to be very difficult because Labour's had a very difficult start. They made these big promises about housing and things like that. It's very unclear whether they'll be able to deliver it. And they've got to convince people that they are real problems that people think that they are addressing and making progress, because otherwise you lay yourself wide open to the daft, empty, simplistic promises of a Farage.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, and I don't have the answer now, but who is Labour's enemy? Who is getting in the way of Labour delivering? And I don't think it's clear enough.
I don't think it's going to be one person or one organisation.
No, but it could be but it's got to be something simple enough that I don't think it has to be a person, but finding a way in which you could have.
Then it will vary according to what the issue is too. I mean, the culprit in immigration isn't going to be the same as the culprit of, probably sleepy planners in housing. What's holding that back? I'm afraid I'm not a policy man, and I haven't got the competence of knowledge or anything to know what's possible or can be done. But I can see what needs to be done.
Which is important. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on the show. That's all we've got time for. I hope the listeners enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Chris.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you very much for having a ranter.